Yep. So, hello again. I will now the presentation on based on my master's thesis, or partly on it, and it's about how to distinguish between semantically closed cases, and I look at the phenomena from the point of view of Mordvin languages, and especially their illative and lative. So, first, Mordvin languages, Ersa and Moksha, have a curious situation that they have two goal-oriented spatial cases, that is illative and lative, but the case paradigm does not have two of any other kind of spatial case, that there's only one locative or inessive, and one separative case, the illative, and one path case, the prolative, but there are two goal cases, which is quite uncommon in world languages. And this, the existence and the variation, the use of these cases have been explained in various ways along the history. The one explanation or view to the situation is that lative is not a case at all, but it's either a derivational affix that derives adverbs and postpositions, or it's an allomorph of the illative that is used in some situations. And the second explanation or a difference that is mentioned is that there are difference between the meanings or functions of illative and lative, or semantic roles that they express. And that's that is why the two cases are in the paradigm. And the third explanation is that the third kind of explanation usually also refers to the different meanings, but in addition they raise the question about the properties of the landmark noun, so that illative and lative prefer different kinds of landmarks when nouns are inflected. And now I will explore some parameters that I have found that seem to affect the choice of goal cases in Mordvin languages. But first, here are the spatial case systems. There are kind of two paradigms, one for content nouns, where there is one local, one source, and one path case, and the goal cases, two goal cases. And then for relational nouns, there are two, or some relational nouns take always inessive, elative, and illative, and others take always locative, ablative, and lative, and then all the relational nouns take prolative case. And that is basically a lexical property of the relational nouns, or maybe a historical development. And then some theoretical background. Again, I look at the data from the point of view of cognitive linguistics, and conceptualization, again, is an important thing, because conceptualization is the basis of linguistic, or uttering things, and it's based on generalizations made from recurring events and general knowledge of humans. And these conceptualizations are categorized based on differences and similarities between previous examples that people have seen about different situations. And then the categorization is used to choose the right linguistic element to express what the conceptualization the human sees and wants to express. And then the spatial relations that are expressed by cases and relational nouns can be considered basically the same, because they both express a spatial or some other relation between a trajectory and a landmark. And as we saw in the previous presentation, the difference lies many times only in the focus to a part of landmark versus the focus on the whole of the landmark. And all of these relations can be situated not only in spatial domain, as the name spatial relations kind of presupposes, but they also can be temporal, causal, or whatever. Doesn't matter. And then cases have meanings or functions. Usually one case have more than one meaning because they are semantically quite general, and different meanings of one case are activated in different contexts, like the linguistic context affects a lot which meaning is activated in the case. And the meanings can be differentiated by a theory that Andrea Tyler and Vivian Evans have proposed, that the meaning have protoscenes in the minds of people, and the protoscene is some kind of a skeleton that abstractly expresses what elements and utterance needs that certain meaning is activated when the case is added to the situation. And protoscenes are differentiated by a functional element. The functional element is the smallest semantic change in the protoscene that changes the whole meaning of an utterance. And then there are also a thing called contextual variants that are expressions of the same meaning, but that have like minor semantic differences in them. And as I said, the relational nouns that are traditionally considered postpositions or adverbs to focus on the attention, usually to some part of the landmark noun. And there is no inherent difference between the relational nouns and the content nouns inflected in cases expressed. And from a like cognitive psychology point of view, the properties of the landmark, this is why I studied especially the properties of the landmark, is that the properties have been proven meaningful in studies. First of all, it has been proven that humans have pre-linguistic spatial prototypes, which they use to categorize different entities. And if there are pre-linguistic prototypes, it probably means that these prototypes are used when speaking about different things and categorized, and the categorization then leads to different kinds of marking of the spatial relations, or the hypothesis at least. And some specific cases that in German, it has been noted that the shape of the landmark noun affects acceptance of different spatial expressions. And for English, the size of the landmark has been proven to be meaningful for expressions of vicinity spatial description. So this all kind of shows that the landmark has an influence on the choice of spatial relations expressions. And then the data has 200 examples, both from Ersa and Moksha, and from illative and lative, so it's 800 examples total from Moksha corpus. And data includes content nouns and those relational nouns that are declined productively. That is that the relational nouns that take all the three possible cases. And I have excluded all lexicalized expressions like over again or kiss because those expressions don't inflect, or they don't have productive inflection. So they must be studied. They don't belong to this study. And then the meanings. I have found these 9 meanings for the illative and lative in Mordvin languages, and target and direction also have contextual variants depending on what kind of target or direction that they express. And the red line marks that above the red line are the frequent meanings, and under it are less frequent. And we will soon see that the frequency difference is quite big. And I don't go to this much further, but as you can see, in both languages and in both cases, or they don't have that much difference in what meanings they can express. And then the classification of landmark nouns, to which this study is based. I differentiated 8 kinds of landmarks. First are spatial landmarks that are either 2- or 3-dimensional, and then bounded or unbounded, depending on if they have clear boundaries. Like you can see, a bounded 2-dimensional landmark is Kalmolanga, that is a graveyard, because graveyards usually are like they have borders, like fence or something that differentiate it from the landscape. And bounded 3-dimensional landmark could be Velje, it's village, which also have quite clear boundaries. And then unbounded are earth and sky, because they are, earth is of course somehow bounded, but it's functionally unbounded, because when humans interact with earth, they usually don't interact with the whole of the planet earth at once, but only a part of it that is not bounded in a meaningful way. And then there are objects, institutions, abstract things, and temporal entities. And these are not differentiated, because it's not meaningful to think if abstract noun is bounded or unbounded, or an institution is bounded or unbounded. It doesn't really make sense. And then I assessed the prototypicality of the landmarks based on the prototype of containment. This is only done for the spatial landmarks, that is bounded and unbounded 2- and 3-dimensional objects. And they are based on the pre-linguistic concepts of containment and support that were discussed in the previous presentation. And again, the prototypicality for object, institutions, or abstract entities or temporal entities does really not make that much sense, so I didn't do it for this study. And here are some results. So you can see on the rightmost column that there is quite a difference between, on one hand, target and direction meanings, and then on the other hand, the other meanings that, like for illative, almost half of the examples, or no, over half of the examples are targets, and the same goes for directions for lative, and the other meanings are quite marginal. Here are some interesting things that should be noted, that 3-dimensional objects take, in my data at least, definitely more lative than illative. I will soon try to explain that thing, but it's kind of surprising. And then the bounded 2-dimensional objects takes like almost every time is when it's a goal, they are inflected in illative. And same goes for 1-dimensional objects and abstract things and temporal entities. They are almost never inflected in lative. On the other hand, institutions almost never take illative for some reason, which I will come to shortly. And then on the same table of Moksha, as you can see, the in moksha the amount of different meanings or the frequencies of different meanings are more or less the same than in Terza. And also the differences in the marking of the different kinds of landmarks are almost the same. The lative is used a little less with three-dimensional objects than in Terza, but not that much, I think. Then the prototypicality and the landmark type. Here the most meaningful columns are the four first ones because object institutions, abstract nouns, and temporal entities do not have the prototypicality assessment done to them. And here we see that the lative is used with less or the unprototypical end of the three-dimensional objects or landmarks, and then the bounded two-dimensional prototypical landmarks take more frequently illative. And at least for lative, the numbers are explained partly because of the relational nouns that are always inflected in lative, and the geographical names, like names of cities that always take lative, are classified here as less prototypical bounded three-dimensional objects because they are somewhat bounded, and they definitely are three-dimensional, but they are not. They neither does have like a clear boundary towards the outside, as which requirement comes from the pre-linguistic concept of containment. And the unbounded, less unprototypical, which is a quite big number there, is basically because of I classify all directions like to the direction of, which are expressed by a relational noun that means direction. So I classified them as less unprototypical, so it might a little skew the frequencies. But on the other hand, the relational nouns express less prototypical situation of bounded and unbounded objects. So it really, I don't think that it matters that much that the choice of case is lexically determined, because the prototypicality and the type of landmark is the same as with content nouns that are inflected in Latin. And then for moksha, same thing. And as we see here, moksha has more or less the same distribution. However, illative is used with less unprototypical two-dimensional bounded landmarks more often than in Erse, but I think that is only because my data had more of these kinds of landmarks and nothing else. And then some conclusions. As we saw, the illative and lative in Mordvin languages definitely are two different cases because they appear in a productive case inflection of content nouns. One cannot say that lative only derives adverbs or something like that. It wouldn't make any sense. And there is some meaning differences attested between Mordvin languages and between the cases, or what meaning the cases can express. But the meanings are not that, the differences are not that meaningful because the greatest differences are actually in the very infrequent meanings. And because the meanings are so infrequent, I can't really draw any good conclusions about it. So meaning probably affects the choice of goal case, but I can't really prove that right now. However, a landmark type definitely affects the choice of goal case. As we saw, three-dimensional objects take more lative, and then abstract nouns and temporal nouns always take illative. So that is one parameter that definitely affects the choice. And to some extent also the prototypicality of the landmark seems to affect the choice. However, here is the thing that because relational nouns, which always take lative, express on more unprototypical landmarks, it affects a little the results. And finally, especially the prototypicality parameter should be studied further. It's probably need for a bigger data, and also probably assessment by speakers of the languages would be useful for this. But there seems to be some kind of like a underlying principle that I have called the specificity of the situation that affects that the more specific meanings and more specific landmark types and prototypical landmarks, which are also more specific, take usually or more frequently illative, and then the more or less specific situations are marked more frequently with lative. I think that there's something to that, but it must be studied further, definitely. And that's all. Thank you for your interest in my speech.
Thank you for your presentation. Are there any questions or comments? Please, colleagues.
I think I have a comment.
Okay, Paulina, please.
Yeah, thank you. Have you differentiated between possessive and non-possessive usages when you looked at lative versus illative distribution? Because I think that the fact that lative doesn't have like its own possessive marker, and we would use like illative or dative possessive form can be intervening. And another part of my comment is that maybe it would be interesting to look at dative in those functions as well as a complementary thing for lative and illative cases in the definite declension.
Yeah, that's true. I should do that. But for the possessive marking, I didn't take any possessive illatives to this study. They were left out, so all of the examples were from basic declension. So illative.
Thank you.
Any other comments? So if there are no comments, we thank you once again, and we shall meet an hour later. Thank you.